Hey, it's Matt Robeson. Here's our latest episode of Political Rehab. And this morning's news of a record jump in U.S. gasoline prices, a surge in inflation, with the biggest monthly increase in the consumer price index since the peak of the inflation crisis 4 years ago, and the announcement minutes ago that the Speaker of Iran's parliament has raised new doubts about whether the current ceasefire can hold or whether a peace is achievable. All of that really confirms everything that you're about to hear in the rest of this episode, which is our mashup of PTI and The Daily Show, where a Republican named Matt and me, a Democrat also named Matt, have a great time hitting all those top stories, blasting Trump, doing our weekly That's Bullshit segment, and always ending with a dose of hope. Please subscribe. Come back here every week, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for this show. And just so you know, I'm live with you right now, but the rest of this episode was recorded earlier. Here we go.
Want this job. This job is not going to end well.
Trump went from blasphemy to barbarism to backpedaling in about 48 hours.
Trump gets impeached, definitely from the House, and who knows what happens in the Senate.
This doesn't seem to be a career test. It seems to be an IQ test.
Republicans, because I have these conversations, we are deeply worried about what's coming.
She's like zombie being dragged back. You got to double kill zombies. Welcome to Political Rehab. I'm Matt Robeson, Democrat and former congressional staffer.
And I'm Matt Wiley, Republican campaign strategist.
Today, war crime threats lead to a fake ceasefire. J.D. Vance sitting on a red-hot seat, a secret MAGA battle breaks into the open, a political earthquake brewing, and the Epstein story roars back into view. Plus, the age trap, shattered friendships, and Melania mishaps. But let's start, as always, with our Trump dump.
Time for the Trump dump.
That's right. Time for the Trump dump, our weekly segment, because it doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, or independent. There is something Donald Trump did this week that pissed you off.
Right now, Donald Trump is in the middle of a toddler temper tantrum that's one of the stupidest acts of traitorous cowardice he's displayed as president yet, and that's saying something. And what he's throwing that tantrum over is NATO. We just had a meeting between Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and every signal says it went badly. No press access, no photo ops, no friendly backslapping, which is the opposite of how these meetings usually go. Rutte comes out and calls it frank, which in diplomatic language means bad. Trump immediately goes back to attacking NATO publicly, and the White House is openly signaling he's considering steps that would effectively undermine or end the alliance from the inside. Things like pulling U.S. troops out of NATO countries he doesn't like, which doesn't technically leave NATO, but guts it. And that matters because NATO is not just a treaty, it's a confidence system. It only works if adversaries believe that the U.S. will defend its allies and vice versa, and Trump is actively eroding that belief. Now, here's the part that is just strategically illiterate. NATO is not some charity that we run for Europe. For a tiny fraction of our defense budget, literally a rounding error, we get a global force multiplier. We get bases across Europe. We get intelligence sharing. We get logistical depth. We get allied militaries that augment our own military forces. That's what allows the U.S. to project power globally without fighting. On top of that, the transatlantic economy, anchored by these alliances, is worth trillions of dollars. Trade, investment, defense contracts, millions of American jobs tied to that system. And Trump looks at all of that and sees a bad deal because he has this infantile zero-sum view of alliances. If someone else is benefiting, he thinks that we're losing. And if he's not personally dominating the transaction, he thinks we as America are getting ripped off. So what he's doing is potentially blowing up one of the most successful strategic systems in modern history, weakening our position against Russia, weakening our position against China, undermining our own military reach, and damaging our own economy, all because he needs to glower and look tough and feel dominant, and because he fundamentally does not understand how power actually works. This is not America first. This is cutting off our collective nose to spite our face.
In a normal Easter post, it would say something like, "We wish everyone celebrating today a peaceful and joyful Easter." That's it. Normal, calm, presidential. This year, Donald Trump posted on Easter an angry, profanity-laced rant that ends with praise to Allah. Now, we're going to talk about Iran and the ceasefire later in this episode. This is not what this is about. This is about the spineless Republicans who stayed silent when Trump said it. Then the next day it got worse. Trump starts posting about wiping out an entire civilization off the map. Trump started floating nuclear weapons. Now, I thought Iran was decimated. I thought they weren't a threat anymore. I thought the Strait of Hormuz was Europe's problem. And Republicans, still nothing. If Joe Biden said this, if he even hinted at this, Republicans would be going ballistic. Wall-to-wall outrage, emergency hearings, cable news meltdowns. The calls for the 25th Amendment would be deafening. Now, there have been some voices. Megyn Kelly said she's tired of the bullshit, and that's a start. But not a single serious voice saying this is too far. Not a single leader willing to stand up and draw a line. Nothing. This is the easiest test in politics. You don't need a briefing. You don't need polling. When the president starts talking like this, you say no. You stand up. You draw a line. You lead. But they won't because they're afraid. Afraid of Trump, afraid of the base, afraid of losing their seats. So instead, they stay quiet. Look, maybe they thought it was bravado. Maybe they thought that Trump didn't mean it. And for members of the MAGA cult, they'll say we got a ceasefire, so it worked. And as a quick aside, it's easy to declare victory when you never actually tell the American people what defines victory. But let me be clear. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a decision. You're choosing to look at this and say nothing. You're choosing to let this stand. That is not distance. That is not ownership. You are making yourselves complicit. Republicans in Congress are cowards, and I too am tired of it. And for those of you who want to dismiss this as just another rant from Trump-hating Republican, no, this is what America First actually looks like. When you put your country over your party.
Well, even if congressional Republicans don't have a pulse anymore, a resident Republican, Matt Wiley, certainly does. So let's get our hearts racing with this week's rundown. As Matt just mentioned, Trump spent Easter Sunday threatening to blow up Iran's power plants and bridges, bizarrely signing off with praise be to Allah, then by Tuesday morning escalated to warning that a whole civilization will die tonight, and then hours later took a ceasefire off-ramp. The story here is not that we had some kind of a victory, which we'll cover later. We did not. And it's not that we have some kind of a coherent strategy. It's that he used apocalyptic brinksmanship against a civilian population, which is a war crime, by the way, to bludgeon his way toward a pause in a war that he suddenly needed to stop for political reasons. Matt, I know you just covered some of it, but is there anything coherent to take away from any of this?
No, absolutely not. There's so many layers when you look at this. First of all, Republicans have a tendency to wrap themselves in God, especially when it comes time to wars. It seems to make it sound like we're on our side. And you see evangelicals in some cases echoing the sentiment. But I think the most notable is what you're seeing from the Pope. The Pope openly criticized what Trump is saying, all but called him out on everything that is out there. But I think the long-term strategy here is he's clearly either trying to get more Republican votes and trying to shore up that Christian conservative base, or they're just a cult, and it might be both in this case. It's going to cause problems because the middle is going to leave, and a lot of those Christian conservatives, they're looking at this and saying, you should not go this far, and I think you're starting to lose some votes over a lot of this stuff.
I'm going to put in the parking lot the question of what the ceasefire really means, is and is not. We're going to cover that in our That's Bullshit segment in just a few minutes. I will say that it's a bad sign for Republicans when the clearest moral voice on this is coming from Tucker Carlson, who's one of the few prominent Republican voices to directly call out what Trump was saying on Easter morning of all times. Trump went from blasphemy to barbarism to backpedaling in about 48 hours. The ceasefire is, of course, not holding initially. There are still good outcomes that could come from this Iran war, but so far we haven't seen any. And it is a complete strategic mess. This isn't strategy. It was panic with bombers attached.
Speaking of God and war, there was a story that at first I actually thought it had to be fake news, but there's a story out there that the Pentagon allegedly threatened the Vatican with military force. And they had to ask J.D. Vance, who has his new book out there about converting to Catholicism. When he said he's going to look into it, they also asked him why he was in Hungary campaigning for Viktor Orban. Matt, what the hell is J.D. Vance up to nowadays?
When Barack Obama was elected, The Onion ran a wonderful headline that said, America gives worst job to black man. And essentially, J.D. Vance is doing the 2020s version of that. It seems like all the worst jobs in the Trump administration have been handed to J.D. Vance in the last week. He is going to the home of autocratic dictator Viktor Orban, who is a Vladimir Putin, Russia-sponsored autocrat who is badly losing in polls in Hungary's election. And oddly, J.D. Vance has the job of going to support Orban, support Putin, really, at the same time that Trump is shoving a spike into the heart of NATO, and at the same time that U.S. representatives are delivering ham-handed threats to the Vatican, basically saying to the Pope Leo, get in line, do what we say, or else. And J.D. Vance is sent in to clean that up. In the meantime, there's this huge expose in the New York Times talking about the planning that went in planning. That went into the decision to go to war with Iran. And J.D. Vance is like sweatily all over this, kind of saying, well, this is obviously stupid and it might end my dreams of becoming president, but I'm with you, sir. Whatever you say. Thank you, sir. May I have another? He is on the hottest of hot seats right now.
As vice president, J.D. Vance is doing a good job because he is doing exactly what the president wants him to do. But what that means is when the shit hits the fan, when the bomb blows up, the shrapnel is going to land squarely on him because he has campaigned against a lot of this stuff. He is against what is happening, but he has to walk along and kiss Trump's ass along the way because that is the job of the vice president. And he is going to fall just like Mike Pence had a problem, just like Pam Bondi, just like everybody else in this administration. It's just going to blow up in their face.
This is really a question, this whole story about what is the future of MAGA after Trump leaves the scene or dies or both. And that's also the story of this next issue that's just emerged, a deep dive report from Politico, laying out the full-on knife fight that's underway to become Trump's next attorney general. And it's not really about that job per se. It's about which faction of Trump world gets control of the Justice Department and the MAGA agenda at a time when their entire approach to justice is under siege. They're losing prosecutors from DOJ, and they're facing a credibility crisis. There are several contenders, Harmeet Dillon, Todd Blanche, Jeanine Pirro, Lee Zeldin, Ed Martin, that represent different factions and different emphasis in the MAGA coalition. Matt, you are our Republican insider. What is going on under the lid here?
First of all, nobody should want this job. This job is not going to end well for whoever. Look, the most qualified of that list, Dillon. Who probably gets it, Pirro or Ed Martin. What it really is, Trump wants someone who can go on TV and drive home the message and defend him at every turn, but do it in a way that makes sense. That's why I think Pirro should be the one that everybody thinks is going to happen. Ed Martin couldn't really even make his way through his first round of whatever he was appointed to and presidential appointments. Quite frankly, is nowhere qualified for it. And I should disclose right here, I've known Ed Martin for a very long time, and I will tell you he is nowhere qualified to be the United States Attorney General. But it is really
like these.
Exactly. But it's a horrible job under Trump world because your job is to dismantle institutions, to go on political witch hunts, and it is not what a true attorney general is meant to do. And that's why I think like Dillon, she is smart. She's capable. Bondi, to some extent, had a background here that she had been Florida Attorney General, could have done this job, and she failed miserably. I think the best person who could be Attorney General would be Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad, but it's probably going to be Pirro.
Look, you're the insider here. I'm not going to comment other than to say this doesn't seem to be a career test. It seems to be an IQ test. the smartest among these will try to duck out of this because they have to be thinking forward in a strategic way about what their career will be left as after Trump. Pam Bondi's career is done. She has no other future professional existence outside of Trump circles. She has completely beclowned herself from any other legitimate enterprise in American life. And the smartest among that list, or perhaps other candidates, will see that and will try to back away slowly. The dumbest will probably emerge in a bizarre version of the Peter Principle.
Yeah, exactly. April has a lot of special elections, and this week we saw two of them. We saw in Wisconsin for a race for Supreme Court, the Democrat just dominated. And in Georgia, the race to replace Marjorie Taylor Greene, yeah, the Republican won in this ruby red district, but the Democrat really performed. So, Matt, I want to ask you, Democrats feeling good about this? Is it going to be a Democrat blowout? What do you see happening right now?
This week was a turning point as far as Democratic insiders are concerned. We actually have hard receipts that the wave that's been building all year toward the 2026 midterms is reaching absolute tsunami levels. What we've seen so far in special elections is an average 11-point swing from Republicans to Democrats. These two races this past week in very different places politically had an average swing of 25 points toward Democrats. That is absolutely massive. You pair it with some new research from Elliot Morris showing that Trump's approval is below 45% in 44 current Republican-held congressional districts, including some deep red areas. This is your base. They are saying we are ripshit with what is happening right now. This is the week where we saw some real-world examples of just how far this might go. And the upshot is something you've actually been predicting for months now, and I've been more reluctant to get onto it because I'm a Democrat, and so I'm afraid to hope. I'm always sure that we're going to fumble this at the goal line, but you're seeing insiders starting to take a serious look at the Senate race in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, the Senate race in North Carolina, Roy Cooper, ultra strong Democratic candidates that were kind of written off as being in tough territory. If those two races are on the board, then now the Senate is in play. And that's a serious threat to Trump's future and to the whole Republican Party. Republicans should be pretty nervous right now.
100% agree. And don't forget, you got the Alaska race that I think is actually within range for Democrats to pick up as well. Everything looks like a wave in April, but the fundamentals of what you're saying is 100% true. And Republicans, because I have these conversations, we are deeply worried about what's coming. We are deeply worried about how to mitigate it. That's why you saw redistricting. Right now, they are trying everything at the White House to stop this, because if Democrats win the Senate, which I actually still think they're going to, Trump gets impeached, definitely from the House, and who knows what happens in the Senate if he gets removed from office. Marjorie Taylor Greene is talking about the 25th Amendment today. That's how nervous Republicans are, because they see the writing on the wall. They know what's coming.
All right, let's close out with the story that we just can't get rid of. And that's definitely a problem for Donald Trump. As the war with Iran seems to be on sort of a temporary pause, the question has come roaring back. What is in those Epstein files anyway? There have been jokes flying around from comedians about how the Strait of Hormuz opening is allowing container ships full of Epstein files to go flowing back to media sources. And there's been speculation all along that this war with Iran has been the ultimate wag the dog exercise. Joe Rogan actually said that quiet part out loud on his show this week, invoking the example of Bill Clinton and some bombings in other countries, and saying this war with Iran is essentially the quintessential example of wag the dog, that this has all been motivated as a distraction from the Epstein files. But they are back. And now Pam Bondi, she's like zombie being dragged back on. You got to double kill zombies. She's being dragged back, subpoenaed to appear in Congress as part of the inquiry into the Epstein files. She's refused to comply. There's a contempt of Congress brewing against her. How big a factor is this, Matt? What's happening here, and where are we going next on the Epstein files saga?
So last week it was vampires. This week, zombies. We're going to hit the gambit on our horror movies. But look, this is, I think we've all long speculated that the war was 100% to distract. I think even firing Bondi, it was hoping that would kill it because Blanche wasn't going to release it. But I think members of Congress are not going to let this go. I think the American public wants to know about this. It's where there's smoke, there's fire. And I think you see in this voter distrust of what's happening in government. And we get our last segment was about the Democrat blowout. But that's because that you're middle of the road, your swing voters think there's something here. They think there's something being hidden. They think government is lying to them, and they think Trump is all part of that, which is why people like Nancy Mace, my congresswoman here in South Carolina, who's also running for governor, is trying to continue to push this down the road because she sees it when she's talking to voters. We have a primary in South Carolina coming up, and she is meeting with voters day in and day out. She knows this is a real question. She knows this is a real concern. And for Republicans, we are not going to win women voters who make up 51% of the vote if it feels like we're protecting a pedophile. And so what's going on here is now that the war it seems to be gone out there, this issue is back. It's not going to go away no matter how much Donald Trump tries, no matter who's his attorney general. This is here to stay.
On this show, we've done vampires. We just invoked zombies. And speaking of the undead, we want to take a deep dive this week into a question of another form of supernatural being that seemingly can't be gotten rid of.
Matt GPT, I have a question. Is there an age limit for president? And if not, why?
80% of Americans want an age limit for president. 80%. Republicans, Democrats, independents, it doesn't matter. The polling is overwhelming, and it has been for years. So why doesn't it exist? Because the only people who can make it law are the exact people it would remove from power. And to understand how we got into this trap, you have to go back to 1787 and the one assumption the founding fathers got wrong. The Constitution of the United States has exactly 3 requirements to become president. You must be a natural-born citizen, you must have lived in the country for at least 14 years, and you must be at least 35 years old. The age requirement exists to ensure candidates would best understand the nation's interests, be most capable of promoting them, and have built a reputation for integrity that inspires public confidence. The founders were screening for inexperience, not for decline. The idea that someone would be too old, too far gone to serve simply wasn't part of the calculus. And understanding why requires understanding what they thought government service was supposed to be. The founders had a specific vision. You were a citizen first, a farmer, a lawyer, a soldier, a merchant. You had a life, a livelihood, roots in your community. You got called to serve, you went to Washington, you did your time, and then you went home and lived under the laws you helped create. George Washington is the model. He walked away from power twice. First, as commander of the Continental Army when soldiers were prepared to make him king and he refused. And again after 2 terms as president when he could have stayed. He left because he believed that's what leaders were supposed to do. He thought of himself first as a farmer and a soldier. The presidency was a calling he answered, not a throne he occupied. Thomas Jefferson had a specific term for this idea. He called it rotation in office. And he was deeply worried about what would happen without it. But the founders weren't unanimous, and this is where it gets interesting. James Madison thought frequent elections were a sufficient check on power. Let the voters decide, trust the democratic process. Madison also made a deeper philosophical argument. All power ultimately belongs to the people. If the people keep electing the same person, that's the people's choice. A law that overrides that choice substitutes the government's judgment for the voters. What they didn't account for was a world where staying in Washington became enormously lucrative, where incumbency became its own self-perpetuating machine, where members of Congress would collect government salaries, government pensions, and government health care, and they would walk out the door into lobbying jobs worth 10 times more. The median age of the United States Senate today is 65. 19 members of Congress are over 80 years old. The 2 most recent presidents are the oldest in American history. which is why in 2023, when Nikki Haley launched her presidential campaign, she made mandatory mental competency tests and a constitutional amendment for congressional term limits part of her platform. Her reasoning was America is not past its prime. It's just that our politicians are past theirs. Congress made its own attempt. Republican Representative John James of Michigan introduced House Joint Resolution 87, a proposed constitutional amendment that would bar anyone from being elected president, vice president, or to Congress if they would turn 75 during their term. Not one member of Congress would sign on to it. And the reason isn't mysterious. The people who would have to pass this law are the exact people that would be affected. That's the trap the founders didn't see coming, because they never imagined anyone would want to stay long enough for it to matter. Which brings us to the present moment and why this question is back in the conversation right now. Donald Trump is 79 years old. He is the oldest president to be inaugurated in American history. And over the course of his second term, medical voices have raised serious public concerns about his cognitive fitness. NBC News medical analyst Dr. Vance Gupta has publicly stated that Trump is exhibiting signs consistent with dementia. Psychologist Dr. John Gartner has noticed that Trump has now taken the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, a screening tool specifically designed to detect cognitive impairment, at least 3 times. Gardner's point is blunt. Doctors don't give you that test 3 times because they're checking for dementia. They give it to you 3 times because they're monitoring it. So here we are. The Constitution is silent on the upper end of age. The founders assumed the problem would solve itself through civic virtue and democratic norms. Congress has demonstrated it will not solve the problem voluntarily. Look, America has suffered from 2 aging presidents with concerns about their ability to perform their job. I personally think it's time for age limits, much like we need term limits in Congress. This is not what the founding fathers envisioned. They, like we said in that deep dive explainer, it was meant for people to come home after serving their time. They never envisioned this industrial complex. It's why we have these new rules out there on insider trading and lobbying. As a Republican, as a conservative, we've long been for term limits. Age limits, I think, is a natural progression. What are your thoughts?
I hear what you're saying, but I have a slightly different view on this. I'm against age limits for presidents or members of Congress because the system already has a mechanism for determining whether candidates are too old to hold office, and that mechanism is elections. We leave it up to the judgment of the voters how big a factor that should play. I know this is a very available, very present concern because we've lived through the Joe Biden experience and we're living through the Donald Trump experience. But my original training was as an economist. I majored in economics. I did graduate work that included economics in public policy. And I'd like to make an analogy here to market economies, to capitalism. One of the reasons that we kicked the Soviet Union's ass in the Cold War is that we had a stronger economy. We had a dynamic economy. We didn't put price fixes on goods. We let the market determine how much of everything to make and how much things were worth. And that proved to be a far better system than the kind of wheezing economic system that the Soviet Union used. From the same standpoint, a democracy is better at choosing what matters, how much of everything to make, and what the price and value of everything should be than a price fixing system, which would, in this case, be an age limit. I don't think you have a problem here of needing a law to determine, oh, you can be this old, but not this old, because there are all kinds of complexities to that. What you have in economics is when markets fail to produce good outcomes, the corrective is not, oh, well, let's get rid of the market. Let's fix prices. The corrective is, let's give better information. I think the problem here is not that we don't have an age limit. The problem is voters don't have the best information to make their decisions about who should occupy high office. And I think part of the problem that leads to this market failure of information is we don't vet our candidates in intelligent ways. We let too much be driven by media serving debates high stakes debates. Think about the presidential debates. They're stupid. They produce nothing but ratings. They're designed not to inform voters or help voters make intelligent decisions about what it takes to perform in office. They're all clustered around who can deliver the best prefab zingers that will go viral on social media. That's not a good measure of who would be an effective president. I would far rather, and then I'll kick it over to you, I'd far rather have a version of what Nikki Haley proposed, some kind of a competency test. But rather than having it be a written exam, which, look, we know a lot of us would fail and we'd argue endlessly, I would rather have it be a replacement for televised debates. We just went through this experience of Trump deciding to go to war. If you read the New York Times deep dive expose on the meetings that occurred, the process that occurred there, why not do a live tabletop exercise where I experienced this as a congressional staffer all the time? I'd have my boss who had to make a consequential decision about how to vote on a closely balanced law. And he'd bring in all of his key advisors and we'd talk it out. We'd present information. He'd weigh it. He'd ask follow-up questions. We'd judge the nuance. We'd talk about the political impacts. And then he'd make a decision and he'd vote. Why not open that up? Let people see the thinking. How does someone absorb information? Can they even absorb information? How do they make judgments? That would be far more elucidative for voters than some kind of a debate or some kind of a hard and fast age limit that said, well, this guy who's 79 is not too old. And that would allow in Donald Trump. This guy who's over 80 is too old. We just need a better system to produce information for voters.
Yeah, look, you're not wrong. I think the issue that I and a lot of Republicans coming off the Biden timeframe, if we exclude Trump from this, we watched with our own two eyes a president that could not do that job. And you and I both know the way electoral politics works, it comes down to a handful of states. And when you sort of get through the Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsins, and then you sort of get to your Georgias and some of the states that kind of ultimately decide elections that you come through, Biden was set up to be able to win that race. Pennsylvania was going to flip back. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. And we don't have, that's not what this is about. But you're right. The way we're making decisions on elections and the way we decide presidents right now, again, coming down to those 5 states or 6 states, depending on the year, opens it up so that we do get a Biden and opens it up so we do get a Trump. And there are clearly issues with both of them that have sort of come through. I have long wanted term limits, and I believe 100% of what you've had to say. Yes, the system is designed to fix that. The ultimate term limit is the people deciding. The problem is we are now getting politicians who are staying in way too long, can no longer function. We still remember senators being wheeled in wheelchairs to be able to cast their vote. And as a result, are they really doing the job? And yes, the people should decide, but there's retirement for a reason. And we've reached the point where it's time, I think, for a lot of our politicians, especially for our presidents, to figure out a way in which we're going to make sure that we do get the best and the brightest, not just someone who can dominate the headlines and get in there. I think right now, America, over the last, what's going to be 8 years, is suffering from an incredible brain drain in this administration and in Congress, because people are just staying there too long and they're really voting for their self-interest. I believe in Americans to make the right decision. I do. But sometimes I think guardrails are important. And in this case, term limits us there. I loved Nikki Haley's approach of competency tests, although Trump now says he's aced every single one of them. Love to see what those tests look like. But we do need to do something. And that's where I thought this was an interesting conversation.
I want to give you 2 examples because I think it's tricky. I do see your point. And I do think it's tricky. On the one hand, I went to graduate school at the Harvard Kennedy School. One of my professors is the guy who runs the newly elected member of Congress program at Harvard, which is what traditionally newly elected members of Congress go to as sort of their boot camp to teach them the ins and outs of how to function in Congress. I helped set it up, run it back in 2000. And working for this professor. And what you see in an environment like that is a lot of people fresh off the campaign. Some of them have been legislators before, many of them haven't. And they come in and they're full of ideas that are totally impractical, won't work for a second. And it leads to what's called in Congress a freshman mistake. You do something that's ill-advised and defines you in your career. One of the things that voters should be able to weigh, in my mind, is what is the benefit of greater experience? Having Republicans for a long time had a rule that you could only serve 3 terms as chairperson of a powerful congressional committee. But what's the value of having someone who's been there for a long time, knows the institutional history, knows how we got to where we are, isn't going to be doomed to repeat history's mistakes, and is able to advise freshmen, here's how you avoid that freshman mistake. I think there's a great deal of value to that, especially when we have non-functional institutions like Congress in having institutional memory and knowledge. That's something voters should be able to weigh for themselves. On the other hand, I want to invoke, it's an example that I've given publicly before, and I'm sorry this is going to be painful for you, but I also, at the Kennedy School, was a teaching assistant for David Gergen, a presidential advisor, including to Ronald Reagan. And he shared with me the story of the fact that when Reagan was traveling in 1986 to the Soviet summit with Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, in Iceland, they had to reconstruct his bedroom on the road in the hotel room because otherwise he'd become highly disoriented. He wouldn't really know where he was. He told me about the tricks that they began to employ to help Reagan get through those latter years. Now, look, I don't know how much of that was foreseeable in 1984. I hear your point that a strict age limit would have taken care of that. Although, again, it depends on where you draw the line, right? Maybe it wouldn't have. I think more important, what would be more valuable in the case of Biden and Trump and Reagan is finding a way to give voters more information about how someone's brain is functioning, how they're making decisions, how they're taking in information, how they're turning that information into the kind of explanation that you need to give as president. That's where Biden failed. It wasn't that he wasn't functional as president. Much of the time, by all the accounts, including Jake Tapper's, by all the accounts that we have, he was functional during stretches of the day. But like many elderly people, he ran out of energy. He would become a little bit more disoriented. And it all showed up when he had to perform and he had to explain his positions in that disastrous debate. And that's one of the functions of being president. So again, to me, I see what you're saying, but the fix here, what I'd rather try before changing the Constitution or changing the law, what I'd rather try is not a version of democratic price fixing, but a version of market solving by giving far better information than the way we inform our voters about the decision they're about to make. That's the fix I'd like to see.
And look, I'd love to see that as an answer. And I think there's a lot of good merit in what you have to say there. And again, I trust voters implicitly. They make good decisions. The problem is just trying to get that information, because in the case of Biden, we were told he is the most, he outworks everybody. The press secretary says, I can't keep up with him. And we know that's a lie. Same thing with Trump. We know any cognitive test he's taken, he's failed miserably. We know, that he is struggling along the way. He's fallen asleep in meetings. He's wandering off on things. And it's sometimes you got to take the keys away from grandpa before he drives a car and kills somebody. And we're running this with the nuclear suitcase, the nuclear codes. There's a lot at stake for Americans when a president reaches this age, and you would hope that the administration, those people in the administration, would be more interested in America than protecting their stuff. But that's just not what's happened. It didn't happen during Biden. It's not happening during Trump. And it won't happen until Americans stand up and start demanding a change and start demanding accountability from their president and start doing it. And I'm not 100% certain on age limits, but I'm definitely in that camp where I think that's the way to go. I think it's a natural extension on term limits, which I am 100% for and have been for some time.
Let me break the fourth wall here for a second and say, wherever you're watching this, if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. We genuinely want to know what you think. If you're listening to this or watching it on Spotify or by podcast, same thing. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think about this. You might be catching it on my Substack. Same thing. We're interested. I think, Matt, you've laid out a fascinating piece of, first of all, historical background, set up the issue very well, and you've made a compelling case. I definitely still see it a little differently, but I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong. And speaking of things that are definitely wrong, it's time to get to this week's edition of That's Bullshit.
Bullshit. Bullshit. Bullshit.
Bullshit.
A bullshit?
We just saw one of the most spectacular examples of made-up, misdirected mishmash from the Trump administration that we've ever seen. And to say that of Trump in this administration is really saying something. I'm talking, of course, about the announcement of a ceasefire in Trump's war with Iran.
Just in, the president has agreed to stop bombing for 2 weeks.
And this truly is a masterclass in the medium of bullshit. And there are so many confusions and deceptions that they're throwing in here. I've really tried to narrow it down to just 3 key things that are going on. And the third one is truly the worst. The first thing that's really fishy about this ceasefire is the whole announcement of it. It's bizarre. Trump declared that the U.S. had won a total and complete victory. Notice that he's doing it on Truth Social at 6:32 in the evening, literally when the national news broadcasts are on. But here's the thing. Trump himself never appeared on camera to do it. This is odd. If we won such a total and complete victory, the stuff that presidents like to hang banners and throw parades about, why was Trump announcing it by telephone? Were there no telegrams? No skywriters available? Seriously, when President Obama announced the killing of Osama bin Laden 15 years ago, he went on live television at 11:35 p.m. Eastern. And this follows the same pattern from the start of the war, where Trump mainly talked about it with reporters by phone. Suffice it to say, it's pretty hard to believe that this is such a glorious victory when the president seems so furtive about it. It's like if your buddy says, "Oh, I've got this smoking hot new girlfriend," and it turns out she lives really far away and he just doesn't have any pictures. The second thing that's clearly bullshit here is Trump's announcement as part of his original Truth Social post that we've received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believe it's a workable basis on which to negotiate. And in fact, that we've already agreed to almost all of the points, so it just needs a couple of weeks to dot the I's and cross the T's. For one thing, Trump can't quite figure out the number of points. First it was 10. By the next morning it was 15. But that's understandable. Maybe this happened.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 15. 10 commandments.
The bigger problem is that this entire idea that it's mostly been agreed to is total bullshit. I owe a big debt of gratitude here to former Washington Post fact checker Glenn Kessler for his Substack post about this. And by the way, Glenn is going to be my guest on my Worth Knowing live stream on Tuesday the 14th. So make sure to subscribe to this channel if you like exploding Trump administration lies. But clearly Iran's list includes all kinds of things that the U.S. would never agree to and would represent an unconditional surrender by America. Iran would maintain control of the Strait of Hormuz, we'd lift all of our sanctions, we'd accept their nuclear program, and we'd pay them reparations. Here's Iran's formal statement, which says this out loud, that America has agreed to back down, leave Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz, accept their nuclear program, lift sanctions, and pay them damages. If that's the agreement that Trump says is basically all but final, what he's really saying is that he's waving the white flag. And that really gets to the third point and kind of the biggest. Remember that claim of total victory, including that the Republic of Iran had agreed to the complete and immediate and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz? Well, it was immediately, completely, and in real time falsified. Here's a release from the Associated Press on April 7th, 2 hours after Trump's Truth Social post, in which Iran says it's going to charge protection money for ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Let's remember what victory was supposed to mean here. And it was slippery from the beginning. Trump said at various times that this was about regime change, stopping the nuclear program, and ending Iran's ability to threaten its neighbors and U.S. interests. Here's the key point. This ceasefire achieves exactly none of those aims. Iran still has enriched uranium. There's no agreement to retrieve it and dispose of it, or even that they can't make more of it. We did kill Supreme Leader Khamenei. However, the regime is still intact. The hardliners are still in charge. If anything, their grip on the country is stronger than it was before. And as far as Iran's ability to threaten its neighbors, they were still firing missiles at Israel even into the hours and days after the ceasefire was announced. And overall, strategically, Iran came out of this stronger, not weaker. In fact, our enemies around the world have all come out stronger. Vladimir Putin's Russia helped Iran to target American troops, and Trump let them get away with it and actually made excuses for them. China has seen us retreat with our tail between our legs after our adversary attacked the Strait of Hormuz. And how much do you want to bet that they're looking at another strait and calculating just how much they can get away with? I said at the outset of this war that even though it was misguided, nonsensical, haphazard, it was still possible that the United States could achieve some good outcomes. It still remains possible, but the key thing is that no good outcomes have occurred yet. No lasting ones, anyway. And the upshot of the ceasefire is that it's not a ceasefire, it's an American retreat. Any claim that this is a total and complete victory, that's just bullshit. And with that, let's turn to our weekly dose of hope.
I was going to talk about the Masters this week. The Masters tournament is the greatest sporting event in the world. A perfect blend of tradition, beauty, and drama. What truly sets it apart is, of course, itself. Augusta National's pristine fairway, blooming azaleas, and iconic holes don't just test the players, they tell a story. Every shot carries the weight of history. Each Sunday is charged with the potential for greatness. And it's not just me. It feels like all of America tunes in. Masters Week often leads to decreased focus, high smartphone usage, and increased sick calls. But no, I can't get away from the moment at the White House Easter egg roll.
Biden would use the autoplay. He'd have an autoplay follow Joe Biden. He didn't sign. He was incapable of signing his in. So they'd follow him around with a big machine, you know what it's called? An autopad.
I have no idea why, but I found this to be one of the funniest things I've seen all week. It felt like Dwight Schrute at Jim and Pam's wedding, stuck at the kids' table, trying to win the room.
From Q3 to Q4, up 17%, while his sales down 2%. It's all there in the report.
Why would they make the bad man your boss if you're so much smart?
It feels like the same guy. But then you got the Easter Bunny standing there, looks like he's in a hostage video.
Tell me what's wrong with eggs. The price was so high. It was 4 times higher than it was a year before. So if eggs is a big thing, and it was a big thing to our great First Lady, who's here someplace. Let's see. I think this is our First Lady.
Trump can't even find Melania, who's standing right next to him. So maybe the good news is, and why this is my dose of hope, is if a bunch of 6-year-olds can ignore him, maybe the rest of us can too.
I think the best part of that is he's looking from one side to the other. He can't tell which one's the Easter Bunny and which one's the First Lady. Seriously, they look like they were separated at birth. Oh my gosh, what a cosplaying costumed stooge our First Lady is. That is absolutely spectacular. Well, for my dose of hope, it feels like everything in the country and the world is spiraling out of control right now. But honestly, I think this week showed the opposite. It reminds me of that Churchill line. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And that's basically what we just watched. Let's start with the 2 biggest stories that we just covered in our rundown. With Iran, Donald Trump makes a series of incompetent, ham-handed, boneheaded decisions, gets us into a war based on gut instinct and bad advice, and predictably, it goes terribly. But the reason we now have even this fragile, mostly fake ceasefire, the reason the administration is bending over backwards to call it a win, is because people hated it loudly, publicly, and democratically. That's not nothing. That's the system working. Messy, late, but working. Same thing on the politics front. A year and a half ago, America made a galactically stupid decision and put Trump back in the Oval Office. You don't get a do-over on smashing yourself in the forehead with a hammer, but you do get a chance to not do it again, or maybe choose a pillow next time. And what are we seeing? Massive swings in elections, a political earthquake building underneath the midterms. The voter is learning in real time. And that's the point of this country. It's not that we get everything right. Definitely not that we get it right the first time. The point is that we get there. We're not Captain America. We're Wolverine. We're not the star-spangled man with a plan. We're the ill-tempered, badly shaven, cigar-smoking, hard-drinking rascal with adamantium claws who screws up, gets knocked down, makes mistakes, but heals. That's the superpower. Not perfection, recovery. And as long as we avoid those mistakes that we can't come back from, weeks like this are a reminder we'll eventually get to the right place, even if we have to try everything else first. And on that note, for Matt, I'm Matt. We'll see you next time.